Most people assume the durability of Viking tools, ships and timber structures came down to better wood and, just harsher people. That explanation is convenient, but it misses the more important reality. Viking durability was not primarily a matter of stronger materials. It was actually a matter of disciplined preservation. The Norse did not build systems that survived because they were naturally resistant to decay. They built systems that survived because they were treated, maintained, and repeatedly renewed with a preservation method so practical it became invisible to later generations. What modern audiences often miss is that Viking endurance depended less on dramatic technology than on, routine material control. The substance at the center of that control was pine tar, dark, cheap, unglamorous, and in practical terms, honestly, one of the most effective preservation compounds pre-industrial Europe ever produced. In some conditions, it still outperforms modern synthetic coatings, not because it is stronger in absolute terms, but because it solves the right problem in the right way. The Viking preservation method was built around pine tar because pine tar solved several failures at once. That is what made it so effective. Most modern preservation products are specialized. One coating repels water, another resists ultraviolet exposure, another seals surface cracks, another inhibits mold. Pine tar was valued because it addressed several of these pressures at the same time, while remaining simple enough to produce in large quantities with local materials. It resisted water penetration, slowed fungal growth, reduced insect interest, protected fibers, and remained flexible enough to move with wood rather than crack away from it. That last point matters more than most modern builders realize. In wet climates, rigid coatings often fail not because they are weak, but because wood is dynamic. It swells, shrinks, flexes, and breathes. A brittle seal eventually fractures. Pine tar moved with the material beneath it. This was not a refined luxury product, it was strategic infrastructure. Viking tar was made by slowly heating resin-rich pine in low-oxygen pits, forcing out a dense, black liquid that could be stored, transported, reheated, and applied where needed. The process was simple in principle and, labor-intensive in practice, which is precisely why it mattered. Tar production required planning, fuel, labor, and repetition. It was not an incidental craft, it was logistical support. By the Viking Age, tar production in parts of Scandinavia had already scaled beyond household use into organized extraction because demand had become structural. Ships needed it, roofs needed it, rope needed it, tools needed it, storehouses needed it. Viking mobility and durability were tied directly to the ability to produce this material in useful volume. The most obvious use was on ships, but ships were only the beginning. Pine tar is often discussed as a ship sealant, which is true, but honestly incomplete. Viking longships depended on tar because clinker-built hulls were strong and flexible, but full of seams, and every seam was a liability if water was allowed time to work. Tar-sealed plank overlaps, preserved caulking, protected exposed wood, and extended the service life of hulls constantly stressed by salt, rain, flex, and impact. But, the same logic actually extended to nearly every other vulnerable material in Viking life. Roof boards were tarred to shed rain, fence posts were coated to slow decay, and wooden tools were preserved against moisture cycling. Even leather fittings and rope were treated to extend their useful life in damp conditions. So tar was not just maritime insurance, it was really a universal maintenance material. This is what honestly modern preservation products often get wrong. Many modern coatings are designed to isolate a material from exposure, but Viking preservation aimed to manage exposure instead. That difference is, more important than it sounds. Modern sealants often create a hard barrier, and when that barrier fails, water gets in and remains trapped, which actually accelerates hidden decay. Pine tar behaved differently. It shed water, but remained breathable enough to let wood release moisture rather than trap it. It did not try to make wood inert. Instead, it allowed wood to remain wood, while slowing the processes that destroy it. That made failure slower, more visible, and, honestly, easier to manage. This is one reason pine tar still outperforms modern products in specific conditions. It is not superior in every environment, and it's certainly not a miracle coating, but in exposed timber, wet climates, working wood and structures expected to flex, weather, and be maintained rather than discarded, pine tar remains, well, remarkably difficult to outperform. You see, it penetrates fibers instead of merely skinning over them. It resists water without creating the same kind of brittle shell that's common in, synthetic coatings. It can be renewed without stripping the entire surface. And when it degrades, it usually does so gradually, not just failing all at once. For field use, that really matters. Gradual failure is manageable. Hidden failure, though, is expensive. That principle made Viking preservation a survival system, not just a craft technique. The Norse lived in conditions where material failure had immediate consequences. A leaking roof wasn't just an inconvenience. It meant spoiled food, damp bedding, and reduced winter survivability. A rotting boat wasn't simply a repair backlog. It meant lost mobility. A failed rope, a softened tool haft, or a compromised storehouse all had very practical consequences in a cold and unforgiving environment. Pine tar mattered because, well, it bought time. It extended maintenance intervals, reduced loss rates, and made critical materials more reliable under repeated exposure. That is really the essence of useful preservation, not permanence but predictable delay. This also helps explain why Viking expansion was more logistical than it is often remembered. The longship is usually treated as the defining technology of Viking expansion, but honestly, ships alone explain very little. Longships were only as useful as their maintenance cycle. A vessel that can't be preserved just cannot project power for long. The Viking advantage wasn't just shipbuilding, it was ship sustainment. Pine tar was part of what made range possible. The same is true of settlements, storehouses, and transport gear. Endurance depended on preservation systems more than on dramatic breakthroughs. What later military doctrine would call sustainment, the Vikings practiced as habit. This is honestly one of the oldest and most useful lessons in material history. Operational reach is determined less by peak capability than by what can be maintained under strain. The Norse preserved what mattered, retreated what weather consumed, and built maintenance into normal labor. That discipline is one reason their material culture endured repeated exposure without constant structural failure. Preservation was not occasional repair, it was routine infrastructure. The real strength of the Viking method was that it accepted decay as inevitable and managed it accordingly. This is where it remains, I think, more useful than many modern approaches. Viking preservation did not depend on the illusion of permanent protection. It assumed weather, wear, and biological pressure were constant. The goal was not to stop them entirely. The goal was to slow them, expose them, and stay ahead of them through maintenance. That is a more durable philosophy than many modern systems built around concealment and delayed inspection. What made pine tar effective was not mystery, but compatibility. It worked because it matched the behavior of the materials it was meant to preserve. It flexed with wood. It penetrated fibers. It weathered gradually. It could be renewed easily. It failed visibly. Those are not glamorous advantages, but honestly, they are the kind that matter over decades rather than product cycles. That is why the Viking preservation method still matters. It is a reminder that the best preservation systems are rarely the most modern or the most chemically complex. Often they are the ones that work with the material, fail slowly, and remain repairable under real conditions. The Norse did not preserve wood by making it invulnerable. They preserved it by understanding how it failed and intervening early enough to matter. Subscribe to History Vault for more overlooked engineering, forgotten survival logic, and the practical systems history left in plain sight. And share this video with someone who understands that endurance is usually decided long before anything breaks.